Chapter 6 of Police Your Planet by Lester Del Rey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6 Sealed Letter. In the few days at the short-lived 19th Precinct, Bruce Gordon had begun to feel like a cop again. But the feeling disappeared as he reported in at Captain Isaiah Trench's 17th Precinct. Trench had once been a colonel in the Marines, before a court-martial and sundry unpleasantnesses had driven him off Earth. His dark, scowling face and lean body still bore a military air. He looked Bruce Gordon over sourly. "I've been reading your record. It stinks. Making trouble for Juergens, could have been charged as false arrest. No cooperation with your captain until he forced it. Out in the sticks beating up helpless men. Now you come crawling back to your only friend, Isaacs. Well, I'll give it a try, but step out of line, and I'll have you cleaning streets with your bare hands." "All right, Corporal Gordon. Dismissed. Get to your beat." Gordon grinned wryly at the emphasis on his title. No need to ask what had happened to Murdoch's recommendation. He joined Izzy in the locker room, summing up the situation. "Yeah," Izzy looked worried. His thin face pinched in. "Maybe I didn't do you a favor, Governor. Pulling you here, I don't know. I got some pics of Trench from a guy I know. That's how I got my beat so fast in the 7th. But Trench ain't married, and I guess I've used up the touch. Maybe I could try it, though." "Forget it," Gordon told him. "I'll work it out somehow." The beat was a gold mine. It lay through the section where Gordon had first tried his luck on Mars. There were a dozen or so gambling joints, half a dozen cheap saloons, and a fair number of places listed as rooming houses, though they made no bones about the fact that all their permanent inhabitants were female. Then the beat swung off, past a row of small businesses and genuine rooming houses, before turning back to the main section. They began in the poor section. It wasn't the day to collect the tips for good service, which had been an honest attempt to promote good police service before it became a racket. But they were met everywhere by sullen faces. Izzy explained it. The city had passed a new poll tax, to pay for election booths supposedly, and had made the police collect it. Murdoch must have disregarded the order, but the rest of the force had been busy helping the administration. But once they hit the main stem, things were more routine. The gambling joints took it for granted that beat cops had to be paid, and considered it part of their operating expenses. The only problem was that Fat's place was the first one on the list. Gordon didn't expect to be too welcome there. There was no sign of the thug, but Fats came out of his back office just as Gordon reached the little bar. He came over, nodded, picked up a cup and dice, and began shaking them. "High man for 60, he said automatically, and expertly rolled the bullseyes for a 2. Izzy said you'd be around. Sorry my man drew that knife on you the last time, Corporal." Gordon rolled an 8, pocketed the bills, and shrugged. "Accidents will happen, Fats." "Yeah." The other picked up the dice and began rolling 7s absently. "How come you're walking beat, anyhow? With what you pulled here, you should have bought a captaincy." Gordon told him briefly. The man chuckled grimly. "Well, that's Mars," he said, and turned back to his private quarters. Mostly it was routine work. They came on a drunk later, collapsed in an alley. But the muggers had apparently given up before Izzy and Gordon arrived, since a man had his wallet clutched in his hand. Gordon reached for it, twisting his lips. Izzy stopped him. "It ain't honest, Governor. If the geese in the wagon clean him, or the desk man gets it, that's their business, but I'm going to run a straight beat or else." That was followed by a call to remove a berserk spaceman from one of the so-called rooming houses. Gordon noticed that workmen were busy setting up a heavy wooden gate in front of the entrance to the place. There were a lot of such preparations going on for the forthcoming elections. Then the shift was over, but Gordon wasn't too surprised when his relief showed up 2 hours late. He'd half expected some such nastiness from Trench, but he was surprised at the look on his tardy relief's face. The man seemed to avoid facing him, muttered, "Captain says report in person at once," and swung out of the scooter and onto his beat without further words. Gordon was met there by blank faces and averted looks, but someone nodded toward Trench's office, and he went inside. Trench sat chewing on a cigar. "Gordon, what does security want with you?" "Security? Not a damn thing if I can help it. They kicked me off Earth on a yellow ticket, if that's what you mean." "Yeah." Trench shoved a letter forward. It bore the official business seal of Solar Security and was addressed to Corporal Bruce Gordon, 19th Police Precinct, Marsport. Trench kept his eyes on it, his face filled with suspicion and the vague fear most men had for security. "Yeah," he said again. "Okay, probably routine. Only next time, Gordon, put the facts on your record with the force. If you're a deportee, it should show up, that's all." Bruce Gordon went out, holding the envelope. The warning in Trench's voice wasn't for any omission on his record, he knew. He shoved the envelope into his belt pocket and waited until he was in his own room before opening it. It was terse and unsigned. "Report expected overdue. Failure to observe duty will result in permanent resettlement to Mercury." He swore coldly and methodically, while his stomach dug knots in itself. The damn stupid blundering fools. That was all Trench and the police gang had to see. It was obvious that the letter had been opened. Sure, report at once, drop a letter in the mailbox, and the next morning it would be turned over to Commissioner Arliss' office. Report and find Mars a worse place than Mercury could ever be. He felt sick as he stood up to find paper and pen and write a terse factual account of his own personal doings, minus any hint of anything wrong with the system here. Security might think it was enough for the moment, and the local men might possibly decide it a mere required formality. At least it would stall things off for a while. But Gordon knew now that he could never hope to get back to Earth legally. That vague promise by security was so much hogwash, yet it was surprising how much he had counted on it. He tore the envelope from security into tiny shreds, too small for Mother Corey to make sense of, and went out to mail the letter. Feeling the few bills in his pocket, as usual, less than 100 credits. He passed a sound truck blatting out a campaign speech by candidate Nolan, filled with too obvious facts about the present administration, together with hints that Wayne had paid to have Nolan assassinated. Gordon saw a crowd around it and was surprised until he recognized them as rafters, men from the biggest of the gangs supporting Wayne. The few citizens on the street who drifted toward the truck took a good look at them and moved on hastily. It seemed incredible that Wayne could be reelected, though even with the power of the gang, Nolan was probably a grafter too. But he'd at least be a change, and certainly the citizens were aching for that. The next day his relief was later. Gordon waited, trying to swallow their petty punishments, but it went against the grain. Finally he began making the rounds, acting as his own nightman. The owners of the joints didn't care whether they paid the second daily dole to the same man or another, but they wouldn't pay it again that same night. He'd managed to tap most of the places before his relief showed. He made no comment, but dutifully filled out the proper portion of both takes for the voluntary donation box. It wouldn't do his record any good with Trench, but it should put an end to the overtime. Trench, however, had other ideas. The overtime continued, but it was dull after that, which made it even more tiring. But the time he took a special release out to the spaceport was the worst. Seeing the big ship ready for takeoff, back to Earth. Then it was the day before election. The street was already bristling with barricades around the entrances, and everything ran with a last desperate restlessness, as if there would be no tomorrow. The operators all swore that Wayne would be elected, but seemed to fear a miracle. On the poor section of the beat, there was a spiritless hope that Nolan might come in with his reform program. Men who would normally have been punctilious about their payments were avoiding Bruce Gordon, if in hope that, by putting it off a day or so, they could run into a period where no such payment would ever be asked, or a smaller one at least, and he was too tired to chase them down. His collections had been falling off already, and he knew that he'd be on the carpet for that, if he didn't do better. It was a rich territory, and required careful mining. Even as the week had gone, he still had more money in his wallet than he had expected, but there had to be still more before night. He was lucky. He came on a pusher working one of the better houses, long after his collection should have been over. He knew by the man's face that no protection had been paid higher up. The pusher was well heeled. Gordon confiscated the money. This time, Izzy made no protest. Lifting the role of anyone outside the enforced part of Mars laws was apparently honest in his eyes. He nodded and pointed to the man's belt. "Pick up the snow, too." The pusher's face paled. He must have had his total capital with him, because stark ruin shone in his eyes. "Good God, Sergeant," he pleaded. "Leave me something. I'll make it right. I'll cut you in. I gotta have some of that for myself." Gordon grimaced. He couldn't work up any great sympathy for anyone who made a living out of drugs. They cleaned the pusher and left him sitting on the steps, a picture of slumped misery. Izzy nodded approval. Let him feel it a while. No sense jailing him yet. Bloody fool had no business starting without lining the groove. Anyhow, we'll get a bunch of credits for the stuff when we turn it in. "Credits?" Gordon asked. "Sure." Izzy patted the little package. "We get a quarter value. Captain probably gets 50% from one of the pushers who lined with him. Everybody's happy." "Why not push it ourselves?" Gordon asked in disgust. "Wouldn't be honest, Governor. Cops are supposed to turn it in." Trench was almost jovial when he weighed the package and examined to find how much it had been cut. He issued them slips, which they added as part of the contributions. "Good work." "You too, Gordon. Best week in the territory for a couple of months. I guess the citizens like you, the way they treat you." He laughed at his stale joke, and Gordon was willing to laugh with him. The credit on the dope had paid for most of the contributions. For once he had money to show for the week. Then Trench motioned Bruce Gordon forward and dismissed Izzy with a nod of his head. "Something to discuss, Gordon. Isaacs were holding a little meeting, so wait around. You're a sergeant already, but Gordon, I'm offering you a chance. There aren't enough openings for all the good men, but oh, bother the soft soap. We're still short on election funds, so there's a raffle. The 2 men holding winning tickets get bucked up to sergeants. 100 credits a ticket." "How many?" He frowned suddenly as Gordon counted out 3 bills. "You have a better chance with more tickets. A much better chance." The hint was hardly veiled. Gordon stuck the tickets into his wallet. Mars was a fine planet for picking up easy money, but holding it was another matter. Trench counted the money and put it away. "Thanks, Gordon. That fills my quota. Look, you've been on overtime all week. Why not skip the meeting? Isaacs can brief you later. Go out and get drunk or something. The comparative friendliness of the peace offering was probably the ultimate in graciousness from Trench. Idly, Gordon wondered what kind of pressures the captains were under. It must be pretty stiff, judging by the relief the man was showing at making quota. "Thanks," he said, but his voice was bitter in his ears. "I'll go home and rest. Drinking costs too much for what I make. It's a good thing you don't have income tax here." "We do," Trench said flatly. 40%. Better make out a form next week and start paying it regularly. But you can deduct your contributions here." Gordon got out before he learned more good news. End of Chapter 6. Of Police Your Planet by Lester Del Rey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. Electioneering. As Bruce Gordon came out from the precinct house, he noticed the sounds first under the huge dome that enclosed the main part of the city. The heavier air pressure permitted normal travel of sound, and he'd become sensitive to the voice of the city after the relative quiet of the 19th precinct. But now the normal noise was different. There was an undertone of hushed waiting, with the sharp bursts of hammering and last-minute work standing out sharply through it. Voting booths were being finished here and there, and at one a small truck was delivering ballots. Voting by machine had never been established here. Wherever the booths were being thrown up, the nearby establishments were rushing gates and barricades in front of the buildings. Most of the shops were already closed, even some of the saloons. To make up for it, stands were being placed along the streets, carrying banners that proclaimed free beer for all loyal administration friends. The few bars that were still open had been blessed with the sign of some mob, and obviously were well staffed with hoodlums ready to protect the proprietor. Private houses were boarded up. The scattering of last-minute shoppers along the streets showed that most of the citizens were laying in supplies to last until after election. Gordon passed the First Marsport Bank and saw that it was surrounded by barbed wires, and with a sign proclaiming that there was high voltage in the wires. Watching the operation was Juergens. It was obvious that his hoodlums had been hired for the job. Toward the edge of the dome, where Mother Corey's place was, the narrower streets were filling with the gangs. Already half drunk and marching about with their banners and printed signs. Curiously enough, all the gangs weren't working for Wayne's re-election. The big Starpoint gang had apparently grown tired of the increasing cost of protection from the government and was actively campaigning for Nolan. Their home territory reached nearly to Mother Corey's, before it ran into the no-man's land separating it from the gang of Nick the Croup. The Croupsters were loyal to Wayne. Gordon turned into his usual shortcut, past a rambling plastics plant, and through the yard where their trucks were parked. He had half expected to find it barricaded, but apparently the rumors that Nick the Croup owned it were true. It would be protected in other ways, with the trucks used for street fighting, if needed. He threaded his way between two of the trucks. Then a yell reached his ears, and something swished at him. An egg-sized rock hit the truck behind him and bounced back, just as he spotted a hoodlum drawing back a sling for a second shot. Gordon was on his knees between heartbeats, darting under one of the trucks. He rolled to his feet, letting out a yell of his own, and plunged forward. His fist hit the thug in the elbow, just as the man's hand reached for his knife. His other hand chopped around, and the edge of his palm connected with the other's nose. Cartilage crunched, and a shrill cry of agony lanced out. But the hoodlum wasn't alone. Another came out from the rear of one of the trucks. Gordon ducked as a knife sailed for his head. They were stupid enough not to aim for his stomach, at least. He bent down to locate some of the rubble on the ground, cursing his folly in carrying his knife under his uniform. The new beat had given him a false sense of security. He found a couple of rocks and a bottle and let them fly, then bent for more. Something landed on his back, and fingernails were gouging into his face, searching for his eyes. Instinct carried him forward, jerking down sharply and twisting. The figure on his back sailed over his head, to land with a harsh thump on the ground. Brassy yellow hair spilled over a girl's face, and her breath slammed out of her throat as she hit. But the fall hadn't been enough to do serious damage. Bruce Gordon jumped forward, bringing his foot up in a savage swing, but she'd rolled, and the blow only glanced against her ribs. She jerked her hand down for a knife, and came to her knees, her lips drawn back against her teeth. "Get him!" she yelled. Then he recognized her. Sheila Corey. The two thugs had held back, but now they began edging in. Gordon slipped back behind another truck, listening for the sound of their feet. He'd half expected another encounter with the mother's granddaughter. They tried to outmaneuver him. He stepped back to his former spot, catching his breath and digging frantically for his knife. It came out, just as they'd realized. He tricked them. Sheila was still on her knees, fumbling with something, and apparently paying no attention to him. But now she jerked to her feet, her hand going back and forward. It was a 6-inch section of pipe, and a thin wisp of smoke, and the throw was toward Gordon's feet. The hoodlums yelled and ducked, while Sheila broke into a run away from him. The little homemade bomb landed, bounced, and lay still with its fuse almost burned down. Gordon's heart froze in his throat, but he was already in action. He spat savagely into his hand and jumped for the bomb. If the fuse was powder-soaked, he had no chance. He brought his palm down against it and heard a faint hissing. Then he held his breath, waiting. No explosion came. It had been a crude job with only a wick for a fuse. Sheila Corey had stopped at a safe distance. Now she grabbed at her helpers and swung them with her. The three came back, Sheila in the lead with her knife flashing. Gordon sidestepped her rush and met the other two head-on, his knife swinging back. His foot hit some of the rubble on the ground at the last second, and he skidded. The leading mobster saw the chance and jumped for him. Gordon bent his head sharply and dropped, falling onto his shoulders and somersaulting over. He twisted at the last second, jerking his arms down to come up facing the other. Then a new voice cut into the fracas, and there was the sound of something landing against a skull with a hollow thud. Gordon got his head up just in time to see a man in police uniform kick aside the first hoodlum and lunge for the other. There was a confused flurry. Then the second went up into the air and came down in the newcomer's hands, to land with a sickening jar and lie still. Behind, Sheila Corey lay crumpled in a heap, clutching one wrist in the other hand and crying silently. Bruce Gordon came to his feet and started for her. She saw him coming, cast a single glance at the knife that had been knocked from her hands, then sprang aside and darted back through the parked trucks. In the street she could lose herself in the swarm of Nick's Croupsters. Gordon turned back. The iron-gray hair caught his eyes first. Then, as the solidly built figure turned, he grunted. It was Captain Murdoch, now dressed in the uniform of a regular beat cop, without even a corporal's stripes, and the face was filled with lines of strain that hadn't been there before. Murdoch threw the second gangster up into a truck after the first one and slammed the door shut, locking it with the metal bar which had apparently been his weapon. Then he grinned wryly and came back toward Gordon. "You seem to have friends here," he commented. "A good thing I was trying to catch up with you. Just missed you at the precinct house, came after you and saw you turn in here. Then I heard the rumpus. A good thing for me, too, maybe." Gordon blinked, accepting the other's hand. "How so? And what happened?" He indicated the bare sleeve. "One's a result of the other," Murdoch told him. "They've got me sewed up, and they're throwing the book at me. The old laws make me a citizen while I wear the uniform, and a citizen can't quit the force. That puts me out of Earth's jurisdiction. I can't even cable for funds. And I guess I'm too old to start squeezing money out of citizens. I was coming to ask whether you had room in your diggings for a guest, and I'm hoping now that my part here cinches it." Murdoch had tried to treat it lightly, but Gordon saw the red creeping up into the man's face. "Forget that part. There's room enough for two in my place, and I guess Mother Corey won't mind. I'm damned glad you were following me." "So am I, Gordon." "What'll we do with the prisoners?" "Leave 'em. We couldn't get a croupster locked up tonight for anything." He started ahead, leading the way through the remaining trucks and back to the street that led to Mother Corey's. Murdoch fell in step with him. "This is the first time I've had to look you up," he said. "I've been going out nights to help the citizens organize against the Stonewall Gang. But that's over now. They gave me hell for inciting vigilante action and confined me inside the dome. The way they hate a decent cop here, you'd think honesty was contagious." "Yeah." Gordon preferred to let it drop. Murdoch was being given the business for going too far on the Stonewall Gang, not for refusing to take normal graft. They came to the gray 3-story building that Mother Corey now owned. Gordon stopped, realizing for the first time that there was no trace of efforts to protect it against the coming night and day. The entrance was unprotected. Then his eyes caught the bright chalk marks around it, notices to the gangs to keep hands off. Mother Corey evidently had pull enough to get every mob in the neighborhood to affix its seal. As he drew nearer, though, 2 men edged across the street from a clump watching the beginning excitement. Then as they identified Gordon, they moved back again. Some of the mother's old lodgers from the ruin outside the dome were inside now, obviously posted where it would do the most good. Corey stuck his head out of the door at the back of the hall as Gordon entered and started to retire again until he spotted Murdoch. Gordon explained the situation hastily. "It's your room, Cobber," the old man wheezed. He waddled back to come out with a towel and key, which he handed to Murdoch. "Number 42. His heavy hand rested on Gordon's arm, holding the younger man back. Murdoch gave Gordon a brief, tired smile and started for the stairs. "Thanks, Gordon. I'm turning in right now." Mother Corey shook his head, shaking the few hairs on his head and face, and the wrinkles in his doughy skin deepened. "Hasn't changed, that one. Must be 30 years. But I dunno as a Murdoch anywhere. Took me to the spaceport, handed me my yellow ticket, and sent me off for Mars. A nice clean kid, just like my own boy was. But Murdoch wasn't like the rest of the neighborhood. He still called me sir when my boy was walking across the street, so the lad wouldn't know they were sending me away. Oh well, that was a long time ago, Cobber. A long time." He rubbed a patsy hand over his chin, shaking his head and wheezing heavily. Gordon chuckled. "Well, how—" Something banged heavily against the entrance seal, and there was a sound of a hot argument, followed by a commotion of some sort. Corey seemed to prick up his ears, and began to waddle rapidly toward the entrance. It broke open before he could reach it. the seal snapping back to show a giant of a man outside holding the two guards from across the street, while a scar-faced dark man shoved through briskly. Corey snapped out a quick word, and the two guards ceased struggling and started back across the street. The giant pushed in after the smaller thug. "I'm from the Ajax Householders Protection Group," the dark man announced officially. "We're selling election protection, and brother, do you need it? If you're counting on those mugs, we're assessing you." "Not long on Mars, are you?" Mother Corey asked. The whine was entirely missing from his voice now, though his face seemed as expressionless as ever. "What does your boss Jurgens figure on doing, punk? Taking over all the rackets for the whole city?" The dark face snarled, while the giant moved a step forward. Then he shrugged. "Okay, fatty. So Jurgens is behind it. So now you know, and I'm doubling your assessment, right now. To you it's—" A heavy hand fell on the man's shoulder, and Mother Corey leaned forward slightly. Even in Mars gravity, his bulk made the other buckle at the knees. The hand that had been reaching for the knife yanked the weapon out and brought it up sharply. Gordon started to step in then, but there was no time. Mother Corey's free hand came around in an open palm slap that lifted the collector up from the floor and sent him reeling back against a wall. The knife fell from the crook's hand, and the dark face turned pale. He sagged down the wall limply. The giant opened his mouth and took a half-step forward, but the only sound he made was a choking gobble. Mother Corey moved without seeming haste, but before the other could make up his mind, there was a series of motions that seemed to have no pattern. The giant was spun around somehow. One arm was jerked back behind him. Then the other was forced up to it. Mother Corey held the wrists in one hand, put his other under the giant's crotch, and lifted. Carrying the big figure off the floor, the old man moved toward the seal. His foot found the button, snapping the entrance open. He pitched the giant out overhanded, holding the entrance. He reached for the dark man with one hand and tossed him on top of the giant. "To me it's nothing," he called out. "Take these two back to young Jurgens, boys, and tell him to keep his punks out of my house." The entrance snapped shut then, and Corey turned back to Gordon, wiping the wisps of hair from his face. He was still wheezing asthmatically, but there seemed to be no change in the rhythm of his breathing. "As I was going to say, Cobber," he said, "we've got a little social game going upstairs. The room with the window. Fine view of the parades. We need a fourth." Gordon started to protest that he was tired and needed his sleep. Then he shrugged. Corey's house was one of the few that had kept some relation to Earth styles by installing a couple of windows in the second story, and it would give a perfect view of the street. He followed the old man up the stairs. Two other men were already in the surprisingly well-furnished room at the little table set up near the window. Bruce Gordon recognized one of them as Randolph, the publisher of the little opposition paper. The man's pale blondness, weak eyes, and generally rabbity expression totally belied the courage that had permitted him to keep going at his hopeless task of trying to clean up Marsport. The Crusader was strictly a one-man weekly against Mayor Wayne's Chronicle, with its Earth comics and daily circulation of over 100,000. Wayne apparently let the paper stay in business to give himself a talking point about fair play, but Randolph walked with a limp from the last working over he had received. "Hi, Gordon," he said. His thin, high voice was cool and reserved, in keeping with the opinion he had expressed publicly of the police as a body. But he did not protest Corey's selection of a partner. "This is Ed Prager. He's an engineer on our railroad." Gordon acknowledged the introduction automatically. He'd almost forgotten that Marsport was the center of a thinly populated area, stretching for 1,000 miles in all directions beyond the city, connected by the winding link of the electric monorail. So there really is a surrounding countryside, he said. Prager nodded. He was a big, open-faced man, just turning bald. His handshake was firm and friendly. There are even cities out there, Gordon. Nothing like Marsport, but that's no loss. That's where the real population of Mars is. Decent people. Men who are going to turn this into a real planet someday. There are plenty like that here, too, Randolph said. He picked up the cards. First ace deals. Damn it, Mother, sit down wind for me, won't you? Or else take a bath. Mother Corey chuckled and wheezed his way up out of the chair, exchanging places with Gordon. I got a surprise for you, Cobber, he said, and there was only amusement in his voice. I got me in 50 gallons of water today, and tomorrow I'd do just that. Made up my mind. There was going to be a clean-up in Marsport, even if Wayne does win. And stop examining the cards, Bruce. I don't cheat my friends. The readers are all put away for old time's sake. Randolph shrugged and went on as if he hadn't interrupted himself. 90% of Marsport is decent. They have to be. It takes at least 9 honest men to support a crook. They come up here to start over, maybe spent half their life saving up for the trip. They hear a man can make 50 credits a day in the factories, or strike it rich crop prospecting. What they don't realize is that things cost 10 times as much here, too. They plan maybe on getting rich and going back to Earth. Nobody goes back. Mother Corey wheezed. I know. His eyes rested on Gordon. A lot don't want to, Prager said. I never meant to go back. I've got me a farm up north. Another 10 years and I'll retire to it. My kids are up there now. Grandkids, that is. They're Martians. Maybe you won't believe me, but they can breathe the air here without a helmet. The others nodded. Gordon had learned that a fair number of third-generation people got that way. Their chests were only a trifle larger, and their heartbeat only a few points higher. It was an internal adaptation, like the one that had occurred in test animals reared at simulated 40,000 feet altitude on Earth, before Mars was ever settled. They'll take the planet away from Earth yet, Randolph agreed. Marsport is strictly artificial. It's kept going only because it's the only place where Earth will set down her ships. If security doesn't do anything, time will. Security, Gordon muttered bitterly. Security was good at getting people in trouble, but he had seen no other sign of it. Randolph frowned over his cards. Yeah, I know the government set them up, gave them a mixture of powers, and has been trying to keep them from working ever since. But somehow they didn't clean up Venus, and every crook here is scared to death of the name. How come a muckraking newspaperman like you never turned up anything on them, Gordon? Gordon shrugged. It was the first reference he'd heard to his background, and he preferred to let it drop. But Mother Corey cut in, his voice older and hoarser, and the skin on his jowls even grayer than usual. Don't sell them short, Cobber. I did once. You forget them. Here after a while, but they're around. Bruce Gordon felt something run down his armpit, and a chill creep up his back. Out on the street, a sudden whooping began, and he glanced down. The parade was on, the croupsters in full swing, already mostly drunk. The main body went down the street, wavering fluorescent signs, while side guards preceded them, armed with axes, knocking aside the flimsier barricades as they went. He watched a group break into a small grocery store to come out with bundles. They dragged out the storekeeper, his wife, and young daughter, and pressed them into the middle of the parade. If security's so damn powerful, why doesn't it stop that, he asked bitterly. Randolph grinned at him. They might do it, Gordon. They just might. But are you sure you want it stopped? All right, Mother Corey said suddenly. This is a social game, cobbers." Outside, the parade picked up enthusiasm as smaller gangs joined behind the main one. There were a fair number of plain citizens who had been impressed into it too, judging by the appearance of little frightened groups in the middle of the mobsters. Gordon couldn't understand why the police hadn't at least been kept on duty until Honest Izzy came into the room. The little man found a chair and bought chips silently. He looked tired. "Vacation?" Mother Corey asked. Izzy nodded. "Trench took forever giving it to us, Mother, but it's the same old deal. All the police geese get tomorrow off. You too, Governor. No cops to influence the vote. That's the word. We even gotta wear civvies when we go out to vote for Wayne." Gordon looked down at the rioters, who were now only keeping up a pretense of a parade. It would be worse tomorrow, he supposed, and there would be no cops. The image of the old woman and her husband in the little liquor store where he'd had his first experience came back to him. He wondered how well barricaded they were. He felt the curious eyes of Mother Corey dancing from him to Izzy and back, and heard the old man's chuckle. "Put a uniform on some men, and they begin to believe they're cops, eh, cobber?" He shoved up from the table abruptly and headed for his room, swearing to himself. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Police Your Planet by Lester Del Rey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. Vote Early and Often. Izzy was up first the next morning, urging them to hurry before things began to hum. From somewhere he dug up a suit of clothes that Murdoch could wear. He found the gun that Gordon had confiscated from O'Neill, and filled it from a box of ammunition he'd apparently purchased. "I picked up some special permits," he said. "I knew you had this cannon, Governor, and I figured it'd come in handy. Wouldn't be caught dead with one myself. Knives, that's my specialty." "Come on, Captain. We gotta get out the vote." Murdoch shook his head. "In the first place, I'm not registered." Izzy grinned. "Every cop's registered in his own precinct. Wayne got the honor system fixed for us. Show your papers and go into any booth in your territory. That's all. And you'd better be seen voting often too, Captain. What's your precinct?" 11th, but I'm not voting. I'd like to come along with you to observe, but I wouldn't make any choice between Wayne and Nolan. Downstairs, the rear room was locked, with one of Mother Corey's guards at the door. From inside came the rare sound of water splashing, mixed with a wheezing, off-key caterwauling. Mother Corey was apparently making good on his promise to take a bath. As they reached the hall, one of Trench's lieutenants came through the entrance, waving his badge at the protesting man outside. He spotted the three and jerked his thumb. "Come on, you. We're late, and I ain't staying on the streets when it gets going." A small police car was waiting outside, and they headed for it. Bruce Gordon looked at the debacle left behind the drunken, looting mob. Most of the barricades were down. Here and there, a few citizens were rushing about, trying to restore them, keeping wary eyes on the mobsters who had passed out on the streets. Suddenly a siren blasted out in sharp bursts, and the lieutenant jumped. "Come on, you geese. I gotta be back in half an hour." They piled inside, and the little electric car took off from its top speed. But now the quietness had been broken. There were trucks coming out of the plastics plant, and mobsters were gathering up their drunks and chasing the citizens back into their houses. Some of them were wearing the forbidden guns, but it wouldn't matter on a day when no police were on duty. In the 9th precinct, the planters were the biggest gang, and all the others were temporarily enrolled under them. Here there were less signs of trouble. The joints had been better barricaded, and the looting had been kept to a minimum. The three got off. A scooter pulled up alongside them almost at once, with a gun-carrying mobster riding it. "You mugs get the hell out of—" "Oh, cops. Okay, better pin these on." He handed out gaudy armbands, and the three fastened them in place. Nearly everyone else already had them showing. The planters were moving efficiently. They were grouped around the booths, and they had begun to line up their men, putting them in position to begin voting at once. Then the siren hooted again, a long, steady blast. The bunting in front of the booths was pulled off, and the lines began to move. Izzy led the way to the one at the rich end of their beat, and moved toward the head of the line. "Cops," he said to the 6 mobsters who surrounded the booth. "We got territory to cover." A thumb indicated that they could go in. Murdoch remained outside, and one of the thugs reached for him. Izzy cut him off. Just a friend on the way to his own route, 11th Precinct. There were scowls, but they let it go. Then Gordon was in the little booth. It seemed to be in order. There were the books of registration, with a checker for Wayne, one for Nolan, and a third supposedly neutral, behind the plank that served as a desk. The Nolan man was protesting. "He's been dead for 10 years. I know him. He's my uncle." "There's a Mike Thaler registered, and this guy says he's Thaler," the Wayne man said decisively. "He votes." One of the planters passed his gun to the inspector for the Wayne side. The Nolan man gulped and nodded. "He, yes, just a mix-up. He's registered, so he votes." The next man Gordon recognized as being from one of the small shops on his beat. The fellow's eyes were desperate, but he was forcing himself to go through with it. "Murtaugh," he said, and his voice broke on the second syllable. "Owen Murtaugh." "Murtang. No registration." The Wayne checker shrugged. "Next." "It's Murtaugh. Murtagh. Owen Murtaugh, of 738 Morrissey." "Protest." The Wayne man cut off the frantic wriggling of the Nolan checker's finger toward the line in the book. When a man can't get the name straight the first time, it's suspicious. The supposedly neutral checker nodded. "Better check the name off, unless the real Murtaugh shows up. Any objections, yeoman?" The Nolan man had no objections, outwardly. He was sweating and in surprise, and the surprise in his eyes indicated that this was all new to him. Bruce Gordon came next, showing his badge. He was passed with a nod, and headed for the little closed-off polling place, but the Wayne man touched his arm and indicated a ballot. There were 2 piles, and this pile was already filled out for Wayne. "Saves trouble, unless you want to do it yourself," he suggested. Gordon shrugged and shoved it into the slot. He went outside and waited for Izzy to follow. It was raw beyond anything he'd expected, but at least it saved any doubt about the votes. The procedure was the same at the next booth. Though they had more trouble, the Nolan man there was a fool, neither green nor agreeable. He protested vigorously, in spite of a suspicious bruise along his temple, and finally made some of the protest stick. Gordon began to wonder how it could be anything but a clear, unanimous vote, at that rate. Izzy shook his head. "Wayne'll win, but not that easy. The sticks don't have strong mobs, and they'll pile up a heavy Nolan vote, and you'll see things hum soon." Gordon had voted 3 times under the honor system before he saw. They were just nearing a polling place when a heavy truck came careening around a corner. Men began piling out of the back before it stopped. Men armed with clubs and stones. They were in the middle of the planters at once, striking without science, but with ferocity. The line waiting to vote broke up, but the citizens had apparently organized with care. A good number of the men in the line were with the attackers. There was the sound of a shot and a horrified cry. For a second the citizens broke. Then a wave of fury seemed to wash over them at the needless risk to the safety of all. The horror of rupturing the dome was strongly ingrained in every citizen of Marsport. They drew back, then made a concerted rush. There was a trample of bodies, but no more shots. In a minute the citizens' group was inside, ripping the fixed ballots to shreds, filling out and dropping their own. They ignored the registration clerks. A whistle had been shrilling for minutes. Now another group came into the scene, and the planters' men began getting out rapidly. Some of the citizens looked up and yelled, but it was too late. From the approaching cars, pipes projected forward, streams of liquid jetted out, and their agonized cries followed. Even where he stood, Gordon could smell the fumes of ammonia. Izzy's face tensed, and he swore. Inside the dome, they're poisoning the air. But the trick worked. In no time, men in crude masks were clearing out the booth, driving the last struggling citizens away, and getting ready for business as usual. Murdoch turned on his heel. "I've had enough. I've made up my mind," he said. "The cable offices must be open for the doctored reports on the election to Earth. Where's the nearest?" Izzy frowned, but supplied the information. Bruce Gordon pulled Murdoch aside. "Come off the head cop role. It won't work. They must have had reports on elections before this. Damn the trouble. It's never been this raw before. Look at Izzy's face, Gordon. Even he's shocked. Something has to be done about this before worse happens. I've still got connections back there." "Okay," Gordon said bitterly. He'd like Asa Murdoch had begun to respect him. It hurt to see that what he'd considered hard-headedness was just another case of a fool fighting dragons with a paper sword. "Okay, it's your death certificate," he said, and turned back toward Izzy. "Go send your sob stories, Murdoch. They taught a bunch of petty maxims in school. Even slum kids learned that honesty was the best policy, while their honest parents rotted in unheated holes, and the racketeers rode around in fancy cars. It had got him once. He'd refused to take a dive as a boxer. He'd tried to play honest cards. He'd tried honesty on his beat back on Earth. He'd tried to help the suckers in his column, and here he was. And Gordon had been proud to serve under Murdoch. "Come on, Izzy," he said. "Let's vote." Izzy shook his head. "It ain't right, Governor." "Let him do what he damn pleases," Gordon told him. Izzy's small face puckered up in lines of worry. "No, I don't mean him. I mean this business of using ammonia. I know some of the G's trying to vote. They've been paying me off, and that's a retainer, you might say. Now this gang tries to poison them. I'm still running an honest beat, and I bloody well can't vote for that. Uniform or no uniform, I'm walking beat today, and the first G that gives trouble to the men who pay me gets a knife where he eats. When I get paid for a job, I do the job." Gordon watched him head down the block, and started after the little man. Then he grimaced. Rule books. Even Izzy had one. He went down the row, voting regularly. The planters had things in order. The mess had already been cleaned up when he arrived at the cheaper end of the beat. It was the last place where he'd expected to do his duty by Wayne's administration. He waited in line. Then a voice hit at his ears, and he looked up to see Sheila Corey, only 2 places in front of him. "Miss Mary Edelstein," she was saying. The Wayne man nodded, and there was no protest. She picked up a Wayne ballot and dropped it in the box. Then her eyes fell on Gordon. She hesitated for a second, bit her lips, and finally moved out into the crowd. He could see no sign of her as he stepped out a minute later, but the back of his neck prickled. He started out of the crowd, trying to act normal, but glancing down to make sure the gun was in its proper position. Satisfied, he wheeled suddenly and spotted her behind him before she could slip out of sight. Then a shot went up, yanking his eyes around with the rest of those standing near. The eyes had centered on the alleys along the street, and men were beginning to run wildly, while others were jerking out their weapons. He saw a big gray car coming up the street, On its side was painted the colors of the planters. Now it swerved, hitting a siren button. But it was too late. Trucks shot out of the little alleys, jamming forward through the people. There must have been 50 of them. One hit the big gray car, tossing it aside. It was Trench himself who leaped out, together with the driver. The trucks paid no attention but bore down on the crowd. From one of them a machine gun opened fire. Gordon dropped down and began crawling in the only direction that was open. Straight toward the alley from which the trucks had come. A few others had tried that, but most were darting back as they saw the colors of the Nolan Starpoint gang on the trucks. Other guns began firing. Men were leaping from the trucks and pouring into the mob of planters, forcing their way toward the booth in the center of the mess. It was a beautifully timed surprise attack, and a well-armed one, even though guns were supposed to be so rare here. Gordon stumbled into someone ahead of him and saw it was Trench. He looked up and straight into the swinging muzzle of a machine gun that had started the commotion. Trench was reaching for his revolver, but he was going to be too late. Gordon brought his up the extra half-inch, aiming by the feel, and pulled the trigger. The man behind the machine gun dropped. Trench had his gun out now and was firing. After a single surprised glance at Gordon, he waved back toward the crowd. But Gordon had spotted the open trunk of the gray car. He shook his head and tried to indicate it. Trench jerked his thumb and leaped to his feet, rushing back. Gordon saw another truck go by and felt a bullet miss him by inches. Then his legs were under him, and he was sliding into the big luggage compartment, where the metal would shield him. Something soft under his feet threw him down. He felt a body under him, and coldness washed over him before he could get his eyes down. The cold went away, to be replaced by shock. Between his spread knees lay Murdoch, bound and gagged, his face a bloody mess. Gordon reached for the gag, but the other held up his hands and pointed to the gun. It made sense. The knots were tight, but Gordon managed to get the knife under the rope around Murdoch's wrist and slice through it. The older man's hands went out for the gun. His eyes swung toward the street, while Gordon attacked the rope around his ankles. The Starpoint men were winning, though it was tough going. They had fought their way almost to the booth. But there a V of planters' cars had been gotten into position somehow, and gunfire was coming from behind them. As he watched, a huge man reached over one of the cars, picked up a Starpoint man, and lifted him behind the barricade. The gag had just come out when the Starpoint man jumped into view again, waving a rag over his head and yelling. Captain Trench followed him out and began pointing toward the gray car. "They want me," Murdoch gasped thickly. "Get out, Gordon, before they gang up on us." Gordon jerked his eyes back toward the alley on the other side. It went at an angle and would offer some protection. He looked back just as bullets began to land against the metal of the car. Murdoch held up one finger and put himself into a position to make a run for it. Then he brought the finger down sharply, and the two leaped out. Trench's ex-Marine bellow carried over the fighting. "Get the old man!" Bruce Gordon had no time to look back. He hit the alley in 5 heart-ripping leaps and was around the bend. Then he swung just as Murdoch made it. Bullets spattered against the walls, and he saw blood pumping from under Murdoch's right shoulder. "Keep going," Murdoch ordered. A fresh cry from the street cut into his order, however. Gordon risked a quick look, then stepped farther out to make sure. The surprise raid by the Starpointers hadn't been quite as much of a surprise as expected. With no regard for men trying to get out of their way, the trucks of the Kroopsters were battering aside the few who could not reach safety. There were no machine guns this time. They smacked into the tangle of Starpoint trucks and came to a grinding halt. Men piling out ready for battle. Gordon nodded. In a few minutes, Wayne's supporters would have the booth again. There'd be a delay before any organized search could be made for the fugitives. He looked down at Murdoch's shoulder. "Come on," he said finally, "or should I carry you?" Murdoch shook his head. "I'll walk. Get me to a place where we can talk. Get me to a place where we can talk, and be damned to this. Gordon, I've got to talk, but I don't have to live. I mean that." Gordon started off, disregarding the words. A place of safety had to come first. He picked his way down alleys and small streets. The older man kept trying to stop to speak, but Gordon gave him no opportunity. There was one chance. It was farther down than he'd thought, and Gordon began to suspect he'd missed the way until he saw the drugstore. Now it all fell into place, the first beat he'd had with Izzy. He ducked down back alleys until he reached the right section. He scanned the street, jumped to the door of the little liquor store, and began banging on it. There was no answer, though he was sure the old couple lived just over the store. He began banging again. Finally, a feeble voice sounded from inside. "Who is it?" "A man in distress," he yelled back. There was no way to identify himself. He could only hope she would look. The entrance seal opened briefly. Then it flashed open all the way. He motioned to Murdoch and jumped to help the failing man to the entrance. The old lady looked, then moved quickly to the other side. "Ach Gott," she breathed. Her hands trembled as she relocked the seal. Then she brushed the thin hair off her face and pointed. Gordon followed her up the stairs, carrying Murdoch on his back. She opened a door, passed through a tiny kitchen, and threw open another door to a bedroom. The old man lay on the bed, and this time there was no question of concussion. The woman nodded. "Yes, Papa is dead. God forbid it. He would try to vote. I told him, and then, with my own hands, I carried him here." Gordon felt sick. He started to turn, but she shook her head quickly. "No, Papa is dead. He needs no beds now. And your friend is suffering. Put him here." She lifted the frail body of the old man and lowered him onto the floor with a strength that seemed impossible. Then her hands were gentle as she helped lower Murdoch where the corpse had been. "I'll get alcohol from below, and bandages and hot water." As Murdoch opened his eyes, breathing stertorously. His face was blanched, his clothes a mess, but he protested as Gordon tried to strip them. "Let them go, kid. There's no way to save me now. And listen." "I'm listening." "With your mind, Gordon, not your ears. You've heard a lot about security. Well, I'm security. Top-level policy for Mars. We never got a top man here without his being discovered and killed. That's why we've had to work under all the cover, and against our own government. Nobody knew I was here. Trench was our man. Sold us out. We've got junior men down to your level, clerks, such things. We've got a dozen plans, but we're not ready for an emergency, and it's here now. Gordon, you're a self-made louse, but you're a man underneath it somewhere. That's why we rate you higher than you think you are. That's why I'm going to trust you. Because I have to." He swallowed, and the thin hand of the woman lifted brandy to his lips. "Papa," she said slowly. "He was a clerk once for security, but nobody came. Nobody called." She went back to trying to bandage the bleeding bluish hole in his chest. Murdoch nodded faintly. Probably what happened to a lot. Men like Trench. Supposed to build an organization, just leaving the loose ends hanging. He groaned. Sweat popped out on his forehead, but his eyes never left Gordon's. "Hell's going to pop. The government's just waiting to step in. Earth wants to take over." "It should," Gordon said. "No, we've studied these things. Mars won't give up, and Earth wants a plum, not responsibility. You'll have civil war and the whole planetary development ruined. Security's the only hope, Gordon. The only chance Mars has, or will have. Believe me, I know. Security has to be notified. There's a code message I had ready, a message to a friend. Even you can send it, and they'll be watching. I've got the basic plans in the book here." He slumped back. Gordon frowned, then found the book and pulled it out as gently as he could. It was a small black memo book, covered with pages of shorthand. The back was an address book, filled with names, many crossed out. A sheet of paper in normal handwriting fell out. The message? Murdoch took another swallow of brandy. "Take it. You're head of security on Mars now. It's all authorized in the plans there. You'll need the brains and knowledge of the others, but they can't act. You can. We know about you." The old woman sighed. She put down the hot water and picked up the bottle of brandy, starting down the stairs. "Gordon," Murdoch said faintly. He turned to put his head down. From the stairs a sudden cry and thump sounded, and something hit the floor. Gordon jumped toward the sound, to find the old lady bending over the inert figure of Sheila Corey. "I heard someone," the woman said. She stared at the brandy bottle sickly. "God in Himmel. Look at me. Am I a killer, too, that I should strike a young and beautiful girl? She comes into my house, and I sneak behind her. It is an evil time, young man. Here you carry her inside. I'll get some twine and tie her up. The idea spying on you?" Gordon picked the girl up roughly. That capped it, he thought. There was no way of knowing how much she'd heard, or whether she'd tipped others off. He dropped her near the bed and went over to Murdoch. The man was dying now. "So security wants me to contact the others in the book and organize things?" "Yes," Murdoch swallowed. "Not a good chance, then, but a chance." "Still time, I think, Gordon." "What else can I do?" Bruce Gordon asked. He knew it was no answer, but Asa Murdoch apparently accepted it as a promise. The gray speckled hand relaxed and rolled sideways on the bloody pillow. "Dead," Gordon said to the woman as she came up with the twine. "Dead fighting windmills, and maybe winning. I don't know." He turned toward Sheila, a split second too late. The girl came up from the floor with a single push of her arm. She pivoted on her heel, hit the door, and her heels were clattering on the stairs. Before Gordon could reach the entrance, she was whipping around into an alley. He watched her go, sick inside, and the last he saw was the hand she held up, waving the little black book at him. He turned back into the liquor shop. The woman seemed to read his face. "I should have watched her. It is a bad day for me, young man. I failed Papa. I failed the poor man who died. And now I have failed you. It is better." He caught her as she fell toward him. She relaxed after a second. "Upstairs, please," she whispered, "beside Papa." There was nothing else. And these Martian poisons, they are so sure they don't hurt. 5 minutes more, I think. Stay with me. I'll tell you how Papa and I got married. I want somebody should know how it was with us once together. He stayed, then picked the two bodies up and moved them from the floor onto the bed, where he had first seen the old man. He moved Murdoch's body aside and covered the two gently. Finally he went down the stairs, carrying Murdoch with him. The man's weight was a stiff load even on Mars, but somehow he couldn't leave his body with the old couple. He stopped finally 10 blocks of narrow alleys away and put Murdoch down. Now he had no witnesses except Sheila Corey. He had no book, no clues as to whom to see and what to do. He heard the sound of a mobile amplifier and strained his ears toward it. He got enough to know that Wayne had won a thumping victory, better than 3-2. Isaiah Trench was still captain of the 7th Precinct. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Police Your Planet by Lester Del Rey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. Contraband. Elections were over, but the few dim lights along the street showed only boarded up and darkened buildings. There were sounds of stirring, but no one was trusting that the Election Day brawls were completely ended yet. Gordon hesitated, then swung glumly toward a corner where he could find a police call box. He heard a tiny patrol car turn the corner and ducked back into another alley to wait for it to go by. But they weren't looking for him. Their spotlight caught a running boy, clutching a few thin copies of The Crusader under a scrawny arm. After the cops had dumped the unconscious kid into the back of the small squad car and gone looking for more game, Gordon went over to look at the tattered scraps left of the opposition paper. Randolph wasn't preaching this time, but was content to report the facts he'd seen. There had been at least 90 known killings. Mobs had fought citizens outside the main market for 3 hours. Yet, in spite of all the ballot stuffing and intimidations, Wayne had barely squeaked through. By a 4% majority, it was obvious that the current administration could never win another election. Bruce Gordon lifted the cradled phone from the box. "Gordon reporting," he announced. A startled grunt came from the instrument, followed by the clicks of hasty switching. In less than 15 seconds, Trench's voice barked out of the phone. "Gordon, where the hell you been?" "Up an alley between McCutcheon and Miles," Gordon told him. "With a corpse. Murdoch's corpse. Better send out the wagon." Trench hesitated only a fraction of a second. "Okay, I'll be out in 10 minutes. Gordon clumped back to the alley and bent for a final inspection of Murdoch's body to make sure nothing would prove the flaws in his weakly built story. Isaiah Trench was better than his word. He swung his gray car up to the alley in 7 minutes. The door slammed behind him. A beam snapped out from his flashlight into the alley, and then he was beside Murdoch's body. He threw the light to Gordon and stopped to run expert hands over the corpse and through the pockets. Finally, he stood up, frowning. "He's dead, all right." "I don't get it. If you hadn't reported in..." "Gordon, did he try to make you think he was..." "Security," Gordon filled in. "Yeah, claiming he was head of it here and wanted me to send a message to Earth for him." Trench nodded, a touch of relief on his face. "Crazy." Gordon grimaced faintly. "Crazy," Trench repeated. "He must have been to spin that story. By the way, thanks for killing that sniper. You're a good shot. I'd be dead if you weren't, I guess." Gordon made no comment, and Trench said, "I could start a nasty investigation, I guess. But I heard him raving too. Give me a hand, and I'll take care of all this. Want me to drop you off?" They wangled the body into the trunk of the car. Then it was good to relax while Trench drove along the rubble-piled and nearly deserted streets. Gordon heard a sigh from beside him. Trench must have been under tension too. They didn't speak until Trench stopped in front of Mother Corey's place. Then the captain turned and stuck out his hand. "Congratulations, by the way. I forgot to tell you, but you won the lottery. You're a sergeant from now on." Inside, a thick effluvium hit his nose, and Gordon turned to see Mother Corey's huge bulk waddling down the hall. The old man nodded. "We thought you'd gone on the lam, Cobber, but I guess since Trench brought you back, you've cooled. Good, good. As a respectable man now, I couldn't have stashed you from the cops, though I might have been tempted. Mighty tempted." His face was melancholy. "Tell me, lad, did they get Murdoch?" Bruce Gordon nodded, and the old man sighed. Something suspiciously like a tear glistened in his eyes. "I thought you were taking a bath," Gordon commented. The old man chuckled. "Fate's against me, Cobber. With all the shooting, some punk put a bullet clean through the wall and the plastic of the tub. 50 gallons of water, all wasted." He turned back toward the end of the hall, sighing again. Gordon went up the stairs, noticing that Izzy's door was open. The little man was stretched out on the bunk in his clothes, filthy, one side of his face swollen. "Hi, Governor," he called out, his voice still cheerful. "I had odds you'd beat the ticket, though the mother and me were worried there for a while. How'd you grease the fix?" Gordon sketched it in without mentioning security. "What happened to you, Izzy?" "Prize of being honest. But the geese who paid me protection didn't get hurt, Governor." He winced, then grinned. "So they pay me double tomorrow." "Honesty pays, Governor, if you squeeze it once in a while." "Funny you making sergeant. I thought 2 other geese won the lottery." So the promotion had come from Trench. It bothered him. When a turkey sees corn on the menu, it's time to wonder about Thanksgiving. Collections were good all week, probably as a result of Izzy's actions. Even after he arranged to pay his income tax and turned over his donation to the fund, Gordon was well ahead for the first time since he'd landed there. He had become almost superstitious about the way he was always left with no more than 100 credits in his pockets. This time he stripped himself to that sum at once, depositing the rest in the First Marsport Bank. Maybe it would break the jinx. They were one of the few teams in the 7th Precinct to make full quota. Trench was lavish in his praise. He was playing more than fair with Bruce Gordon now, but there was a basic suspicion in his eyes. The next day he drafted Izzy and Gordon for a trip outside the dome. "It's easy enough, and you'll get plenty of credit in the fund for it. I need 2 men who can keep their mouths shut." They idled around the station through the morning. In the late afternoon they left in a big truck, capable of hauling what would have been 50 tons of earth. Trench drove. Outside the dome, the electric motor carried them along at a steady 20 miles an hour, almost silently. It was Gordon's first look at the real Mars. He saw small villages where crop prospectors and hydroponic farmers lived, with a few small industrial sections scattered over the desert. As they moved out, he saw the slow change from the beaten appearance of Marsport to something that seemed no worse than what would be found among the sharecroppers back on Earth. It was obvious that Marsport was the poison center here. Some of the younger children were running around without helmets, confirming Prager's claim that third-generation Martians somehow learned to adapt to the atmosphere. Darkness fell sharply, as it always did in Mars' thin air, but they went on, heading out into the dunes of the desert. When they finally stopped, they were beside a small, battered spaceship. Boxes were piled all around it, and others were being tossed out. Trent leaped from the truck, motioning them to follow, and they began loading the crates hastily. It took about an hour of hard work to load the last of them, and Trench was working harder than they were. Finished, he went up to one of the men from the ship, handed over an envelope, and came back to start the truck back toward Marsport. As the dunes dwindled behind them, Gordon could see the brief flare of the little rocket taking off. They drove back through the night as rapidly as the truck could manage. Finally, they rolled into City Hall, down a ramp, and onto an elevator that took them 3 levels down. Trench climbed out and nodded in satisfaction. "That's it. Take tomorrow off if you want, and I'll fix credits for you. But just remember you haven't seen anything. You don't know any more than our old friend Murdoch." He led them to another elevator, then swung back to the truck. "Guns," Gordon said slowly. "Guns and contraband ammunition for the administration from Earth. And they must have paid half the graft they've taken for that. What the hell do they want it for?" Izzy jerked a shoulder upwards, and a twist ran across his pockmarked face. "War. What else, Governor? Earth must be boiling about the election. Maybe security's getting set to spring." The idea of Marsport rebelling against Earth seemed ridiculous. Even with guns, they wouldn't have a chance if Earth sent a force of any strength to back security, but it was the only explanation. Gordon took the next day off to look for Sheila Corey, but nobody would admit having seen her. He had seen crowds beginning to assemble all afternoon, but had paid no attention to them. Now he found the way back to Corey's blocked by a mob. Then he saw that the object of it all was the First Marsport Bank. It was only toward that the shaking fists were raised. Gordon managed to get onto a pile of rubble where he could see over the crowd. The doors of the bank were locked shut, but men were attacking it with an improvised battering ram. As he watched, a pompous little man came to the upper window over the door and began motioning for attention. The crowd quieted almost at once, except for a single yell. "When do we get our money?" "Please, please," the voice reached back thinly as the bank president got his silence. "Please, it won't do you any good, not a bit. We're broke, not a cent left. And don't go blaming me. I didn't start the rush. Your friends did that. They took all the money, and now we're cleaned out. You can't." A rope rose from the crowd and settled around him. In a second he was pulled down, and the crowd surged forward. Gordon dropped from the rubble, staring at the bank. He'd played it safe this time. He'd put his money away to make sure he'd have it. A heavy hand fell on his shoulder, and he turned to see Mother Corey. "That's the way a panic is, Cobber," the man said. "There's a run, then everything is ruined. I tried to get you when I first heard the rumor, but you were gone. And when this starts, a man has to get there first." He patted his side, where a bulge showed. "And I just made it, too." The mob was beginning to break up now, but it was still in an ugly mood. But what started it? Rumors that Mayor Wayne got a big loan from the bank. And why not? Seeing it was his bank, nobody had to guess that he'd never pay it back. So Gordon found Izzy organizing the bouncers from the joints and some of the citizens into a squad. Every joint was closed down tightly already. Gordon began organizing his own squad. Izzy slipped over as he began to get them organized. "If we hold past midnight, we'll be set, Governor," he said. "They go crazy for a while, but give 'em a few hours and they'll stop most of it. I figure you know where all the scratch went." "Sure. Guns from Earth. The damned fools." "Yeah, but not fools. Just bloody well informed, Governor. Earth's sending a fleet. Got official word of it. No way of telling how big, but it's coming." It gave Gordon something to think about while they patrolled the beat, but he had had enough for a time without that. The mobs left the section alone, apparently scared off by the organized group ready and waiting for them. But every street and alley had to be kept under constant surveillance to drive out the angry, desperate men who were trying to get something to hang on to before everything collapsed. He saw stores being broken into beyond his beat, and brawls as one drunken, crazed crowd met another, but he kept to his own territory, knowing that there was nothing he could do beyond it. By midnight, as Izzy had promised, the people had begun to quiet down, however. The anger and hysteria were giving way to a sullen, beaten hopelessness. Honest Izzy finally seemed satisfied to turn things over to the regular nightmen. Gordon waited around a while longer, but finally headed back to Mother Corey's place. Mother Corey put a cup of steaming coffee into his hands. You look worse than I do, Cobber. Worse than even that granddaughter of mine. She was looking for you." "Sheila?" Gordon jerked the word out. "Yeah, she left a note for you. I put it up in your room." Mother Corey chuckled. "Why don't you two get married and make your fighting legal?" "Thanks for the coffee," Gordon threw back at him. He was already mounting the stairs. He tossed his door open and found the letter on his bed. "I'd rather go to Wayne," it said, "but I need money. If you want the rest of this, you've got until 3 tonight to make an offer. If you can find me, maybe I'll listen." The torn-off front cover of the notebook accompanied the letter, but it was 3:15 already. He was practically broke, and he had no idea where she could be found. End of Chapter 9. of Police Your Planet by Lester Del Rey. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. Marriage of Convenience. Bruce Gordon jerked the door open to yell for Izzy while he tucked the bit of notebook cover into his pocket. Then he stopped as something nibbled at his mind. The odor Gordon had smelled before registered. He yanked out the bit of notebook and sniffed. It hadn't been close enough for any length of time to be contaminated by Mother Corey, so the smell could only come from one place. He checked the batteries on his suit and put it on quickly. There was no point in wearing the helmet inside the dome, but it was better than trying to rent one at the lockers. He buckled it to a strap. The knife slid into its sheath, and the gun holster snapped onto the suit. As a final thought, he picked up the stout locust stick he'd used under Murdoch. There were no cabs outside tonight, of course. The streets were almost deserted except for some prowler or desperation-driven drug addict. He proceeded cautiously, however, realizing that it would be just like Sheila to ambush him. But he reached the exit from the dome with no trouble. "Special pass to leave at this hour," the guard there reminded him. "Of course, if it's urgent, pal." Gordon was in no mood to try bribes. He let his hand drop to the gun. "Police Sergeant Gordon, on official business," he said curtly. "Get the hell out of my way." The guard thought it over and reached for the release. Gordon swung back as he passed through. "And you'd better be ready to open when I come back." He was in comparative darkness almost at once, and tonight there was no sign of the lights of patrolling cops. Then 3 specks of glaring blue light suddenly appeared in the sky. Jerking his eyes up, they were dropping rapidly. Rockets that flamed bright blue. Military rockets. Earth was finally taking a hand. He crouched in a hollow that had once been some kind of a basement until the ships had landed and cut off their jets. Then he stood up, blinking his eyes until they could again make out the pattern of the dim bulbs. He'd seen enough by the rocket glare to know that he was headed right. And finally the ugly half-cylinder of patched brick and metal that was the old Mother Corey's chicken coop showed up against the faint light. He moved in cautiously, as silently as he could, and located the semi-secret entrance to the building without meeting anyone. Once in the tunnel that led to the building, he felt a little safer. He removed his helmet and strapped it to the back of his suit, out of the way. The old hall was in worse shape than before. Mother Corey had run a somewhat orderly place, with constant vigilance. Bruce Gordon could never have come into the hallway without being seen in the old days. Then a pounding sound came from the second floor, and Gordon drew back into the denser shadows, staring upwards. A heavy voice picked up the exchange of shouts. "You, Sheila, you come out of there. You come out right now or I'm going to blast that door down. You open up." Gordon was already moving up the stairs when a second voice reached him, and this one was familiar. "Juergens don't want you. All he wants is this place. We got use for it. It don't belong to you anyhow. Come out now and we'll let you go peaceful. Or stay in there and we'll blast you out in pieces." It was the voice of Juergens' henchman who had called on Mother Corey before elections. The thick voice must belong to the big ape who'd been with him. "Come on out," the little man cried again. "You don't have a chance. We've already chased all your boarders out." Gordon tried to remember which steps had creaked the worst. But he wasn't too worried. If there were only two of them. Then his head projected above the top step, and he hesitated. Only the rat and the ape were standing near a heavy closed door, but 4 others were lounging in the background. He lifted his foot to put it back down to a lower step, just as Sheila's muffled voice shrilled out a fog of profanity. He grinned, and then he saw that he'd lifted his foot to a higher step. There was a sharp yell from one of the men in the background, and a knife sailed for him. But the aim was poor. Gordon's gun came out. 2 of the men were dropping before the others could reach for their own weapons. And while the rat-faced man was just turning, the 3rd dropped without firing, and the 4th shot went wild. Gordon was firing rapidly, but not with such a stupid attempt at speed that he couldn't aim each shot. And at that distance, it was hard to miss. Rat-Face jerked back behind the big hulk of his partner, trying to pull a gun that seemed to be stuck. A scared man's ability to get his gun stuck in a simple holster was always amazing. The big guy simply lunged with his hands out. Gordon sidestepped and caught one of the arms, swinging the huge body over one hip. It sailed over the broken railing to land on the floor below and crash through the rotten planking. He heard the man hit the basement, even while he was swinging the club in his hand toward the rat-faced man. There was a thin, high-pitched scream as a collarbone broke. He slumped onto the floor and began to try hitching his way down the steps. Gordon picked up the gun that had fallen out of the holster as the man fell and put it into his pouch. He considered the 2 and decided they would be no menace. "Okay, Sheila," he called out, trying to muffle his voice. "We got them all." "Pie-face?" Her voice was doubtful. He considered what a man out here who went under that name might be like. "Sure, baby. Open up." "Wait a minute. I've got this nailed shut." There was a sound of an effort of some kind going on as she talked. "Though I ought to let you stay out there and rot, damn it. The door heaved open then, and she appeared in it. Then she saw him, and her jaw dropped open slackly. "You." "Me," he agreed. "And lucky for you, Cuddles." Her hand streaked to a gun in her belt. "Kill him." This time he didn't wait to be attacked. He went for the door, knocking her aside. His knee caught the outside of her hip as she spun. She fell over, dropping the gun. The 2 men in the room were both holding knives, but in the ridiculous overhand position that seems to be an ingrained stupidity of the human race, until it's taught better. A single flip of his locust club against their wrists accounted for both of the knives. He grabbed them by the hair of the heads then, and brought the 2 skulls together savagely. Sheila lay stretched out on the floor, where her head had apparently struck against the leg of a bed. Gordon shoved the bodies of the 2 men aside and looked down at the wreck of a man who lay on the dirty blanket. "Hello, O'Neill," he said. The former leader of the Stonewall gang stared up at the club swinging from Gordon's wrist. "You ain't gonna beat me this time. I'm a sick man. Sick. Don't beat me again." Gordon's stomach nodded sickly. Doing something under the pressure of necessity was one thing, but to see the sorry results of it later was another. "All right," he said. Just stay there until I get away from this rat's nest, and I won't hit you. I won't even touch you." He was sure enough that it was no act on O'Neill's part. He wasn't so sure about Sheila. He checked the 2 men on the floor who were still out cold. Then he stepped through the door carefully to make sure that the big bruiser hadn't come back. His ears barely detected the sound Sheila made as she reached for the knife of one of the men. Then it came, the faintest catch of breath. Gordon threw himself flat to the floor. She let out a scream as he saw her momentum carry her over him. She was at the edge of the rail and starting to fall. He caught her feet in his hands and yanked her back. There was nothing phony this time as she hit the floor. "Just a matter of coordination, Cuddles," he told her. "Little girls shouldn't play with knives. They'll grow up to be old maids that way." Fury blackened her face, but she still couldn't function. He picked her up and tossed her back into the room. From the broken mattress on the bed, he dug out a coil of wire and bound her hands and feet with it. "Can't say I think much of your choice of companions these days," he commented, looking toward the bed where O'Neill was cowering. "It looks as if your grandfather picks them better for you." "You filthy-minded hog. D'you think I'd one room in this place with a decent door, and you can't see why I'd choose that room to keep Jurgen's devils back? You. He'd been searching the room, but there was no sign of the notebook there. He checked again to see that the wire was tight, and then picked up the 2 henchmen who were showing some signs of reviving. "I'll watch them," a voice said from the door. Gordon snapped his head up to see Izzy standing there. He realized he'd been a lot less cautious than he'd thought. Izzy grinned at his confusion. "I got enough out of the mother to case the pitch," he said. "I knew I was right when I spotted the 8-man carrying a guy with a bad shoulder away from here. Jurgen's punks, eh? Thanks for coming. What's it going to cost me? Wouldn't be honest to charge unless you asked me to convoy you, Governor. And if you're looking for the Vixen's room, it's where you bunked before. I got around after I spotted you here." Sheila Corey forced herself into a sitting position and spat at Izzy. "Traitor. Crooked little traitor." "Shut up, Sheila," Izzy said. "Your retainer ran out." Surprisingly, she did shut up. Gordon went to the little space and saw that Izzy was right. There was a nearly used-up lipstick, a comb, and a cracked mirror. There was also a small cloth bag containing a few scraps of clothes. He turned the room upside down, but there was no sign of the notebook or papers from it. He located her helmet and carried it down with him. "You're going bye-bye, Cuddles," he told her. "I'm going to put this on you and then unfasten your arms and legs. But if you start to so much as wiggle your big toe, you won't sit down for a month." She pursed her lips hotly, but made no reply. He screwed the helmet on and unfastened her arms. For a second she tensed while he waited, grinning down at her. Then she slumped back and lay quiet as he unfastened her legs. He tossed her over his shoulder and started down the rickety stairs. There was a little light in the sky. 5 minutes later, it was full daylight, which should have been a signal for the workers to start for their jobs. But today they were drifting out unhappily, as if already sure there would be no jobs by nightfall. A few stared at Gordon and his burden, but most of them didn't even look up. The 2 men trudging along silently. "Prisoner," he announced crisply to the guard. But there was no protest this time. They went through, and he was lucky enough to locate a broken-down tricycle cab. Mother Corey let them in without flickering an eyelash as he saw his granddaughter. Bruce Gordon dropped her onto her legs. "Behave yourself," he warned her as he took off his helmet, and then unfastened hers. Mother Corey chuckled. "Very touching, Cobber. You have a way with women, it seems." Too bad she had to wear a helmet, or you might have dragged her here by her hair. Ah, well, let's not talk about it here. My room is more comfortable and private." Inside, Sheila sat woodenly on the little sofa, pretending to see none of them. Mother Corey looked from one to the other, and then back to Gordon. "Well, you must have had some reason for bringing her here, cobber." "I want her out of my hair, Mother," Gordon tried to explain. "I can lock her up. Carrying a gun without a permit is reason enough. But I'd rather you keep her here, if you'll take the responsibility. After all, she's your granddaughter." "So she is. That's why I wash my hands of her. I couldn't control myself at her age. Couldn't control my son, and I don't intend to handle a female of my line. It looks as if you'll have to arrest her." "Okay, suppose I rent a room and put a good lock on it. You've got the one that connects with mine vacant." "I run a respectable house now, Gordon," Mother Corey stated flatly. "What you do outside my place is your own business, but no women, except married ones. Can't trust 'em." Gordon stared at the old man, but he apparently meant just what he said. "All right, Mother," he said finally. "How in the hell do I marry her without any rigmarole?" Izzy's face seemed to drop toward the floor. Sheila came up off the couch with a choking cry and leaped for the door. Mother Corey's immense arm moved out casually, sweeping her back onto the couch. "Very convenient," the old man said. "The two of you simply fill out a form. I've got a few left from the last time. And get Izzy and me to witness it. Drop it in the mail and you're married." "If you think I'd marry you, you filthy—" Sheila began. Mother Corey listened attentively. "Rich, but not very imaginative," he said thoughtfully. "But she'll learn. Izzy, I have a feeling we should let them settle their differences." As the door shut behind them, Gordon yanked Sheila back to the couch. "Shut up," he told her. "This isn't a game. Hell's popping here. You know that better than most people, and I'm up to my neck in it. If I've got to marry you to keep you out of my hair, I will." Her face was pasty white, but she bent her head and fluttered her eyelashes up at him. "So romantic," she sighed. "You sweep me off my feet. Why, you." "Me or Trench? I can take you to him and tell him you're mixed up in security, and that you either have papers on you or out at the chicken coop to prove it. He won't believe you if I take you in." "Well?" She looked up at him a long time in silence, and there was surprise in her eyes. "You'd do it. You really would." "All right. I'll sign your damned papers." 10 minutes later, he stood in what was now a connecting double room, watching Mother Corey nail up the hall door to the room that was to be hers. There were no windows here, and his own room had an excellent lock on it already, one he'd put on himself. Izzy came back as Mother Corey finished the door and began knocking a small panel out of the connecting door. The old man was surprisingly adept with his hands as he fitted hinges and a catch to the panel, and reinstalled it so that Sheila couldn't swing it open. "They're married," Izzy said. "It's in the mail to the register, along with 20 credits. Governor, we're about due to report in." Gordon nodded. "Be with you in a minute," he said as he paid Mother Corey for the materials and work. He jerked his head and the two men went out, leaving him alone with Sheila. "I'll bring you some food tonight, and you may not have a private bath, but it beats the chicken coop. Here," he handed her the key to the connecting door. "It's the only key there is." End of chapter 10.